The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Today we're going to go back in time to a time before we had refrigerators and freezers. Ice had to be used for refrigeration and made naturally, meaning on ponds and lakes across the northern United States and in other cold weather climes. The Boston ice trade offers an illustration of how property rights and entrepreneurship managed to expand the trade in frozen water into a worldwide business and improve the lives of millions of people across the whole globe. It's a story that reveals in microcosm the process by which markets and our voluntary society makes for the prosperity and standard of living that we enjoy today. Joining me on the show today to discuss his research on the ice trade is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Dave Hebert. Welcome to the show, Dave, and welcome to Troy University, because you just joined Troy University this fall from Ferris State University in Michigan. So welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Tell us, before we get started talking about this trade in ice, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got here to Troy?
Yeah, my background, like you said, I was a professor of economics at Ferris State University for the last 2 years. Prior to that, I was finishing my doctorate at George Mason University, where I wrote under Richard Wagner and Pete Becky and Don Boudreau. Well,
Richard Wagner is one of the members of my dissertation committee and one of my favorite economists, so we have I guess something in common there.
Yeah, rightfully so. He's a tremendous economist.
Well, we want to get started today, and what we'll be talking about is some research that you've done on this historical example of the ice trade, and you've published a paper on this that was published in the Journal of Private Enterprise a couple of years ago, and it's really, I think, a pretty fascinating story. And so as we get into this, why don't we sort of set the stage? Let's go back to around 1800, before the events that we're going to be talking about today started. If it was 1800 and you lived in Alabama, did you ever have any ice to use at all?
No, I mean, if you had never gone north of, say, the Mason-Dixon line, you would have never seen what they commonly called the sweating rock that would be ice cubes or blocks of ice. You literally had no idea that there could be this thing called ice. And so the whole concept was completely and utterly alien to everyone south of basically Kentucky.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the north, they were like storing some ice that would appear on ponds and stuff, right? So they did have ways to try and store the ice, to recognize like, oh, that there's some value to that, and it'd be great if we could have some of this in the summer.
That's right. So we saw a lot of below ground ice houses where people would dig out large holes and they would just fill them with ice. There was little to no insulation there other than what was provided by just the dirt and just being out of the shade. But even then, only the very wealthy had access to these things. And even still, they only had access until about July, maybe August if you were particularly lucky. So for the vast majority of human history, ice has been nothing more than a nuisance, if anything.
And so there was a very localized trade probably in some of the northern cities. And but then a gentleman came along, an entrepreneur that really sort of changed this whole thing from a very local and non-commercial thing into essentially a worldwide industry, right?
Yeah, in 1806, a man named Frederic Tudor arrived on the scene. At the time, he was about 14 years old, and he said, you know, he had been down to the Bahamas on a summer vacation. He was the son of a very wealthy Boston judge. And he spent the summers down in the Bahamas, and he reasoned that people down there would probably love to have a cold drink to, combat some of the sweltering heat that they experienced daily. And so he set about with his brother initially to try to find a way to sort of bring this frozen water down to the people in the Bahamas.
And he was both an entrepreneur and in some sense an innovator or inventor, right? He came up with a way to try to preserve ice, even though, again, this was a long time before we had refrigerators or freezers.
Right. That's a big point, is that this is well before any sort of insulation or even refrigeration at all. Any sort of cold had to be provided by ice, and it had to be provided by ice that occurred naturally. There was no way to create ice. It just had to appear from nature. And so one of his major contributions was actually an above-ground ice house. And this was a revolutionary thing. As I was saying earlier, all the ice that was stored was typically stored underground. But if you could imagine trying to dig a hole deep enough in, say, the Bahamas or the southern United States that would insulate the ice sufficiently, it'd have to be, hundreds of feet deep. And even then, trying to expand it or anything like that would be very expensive and costly and difficult. And so having an above ground structure that could be constructed very easily was crucial towards this.
So how do you go about doing this? I mean, it's just like, although this is a show about economics, sometimes you see something like this, it's just like wonder, like, how in the world did he come up with what did he use to sort of insulate the ice? Yeah,
so what he did is it's remarkably similar to the Yeti cup that we see today. And what the Yeti cup has is sort of a cup within a cup. And there's a vacuum between the layers that insulates whatever's inside the cup from the outside temperature. And that's how that product works so well. The same is true of Tudor's above ground ice houses. He essentially built, as you can see in the photo there, he essentially built a building within a building. And he had something between 4 and 5 feet of sawdust between the walls of these buildings that acted as a sort of insulation. Now, he experimented with lots of different things, from moss to crushed rock to a few other materials, but he found, particularly in Boston, a prevalence of sawdust from all the sawmills around. It was readily available and cheap. No one was using it for anything. And so he just lined his buildings with it.
And that's really sort of the essence of economic discovery here. He found a use for something that was a waste to other people, and allowed him to solve a problem that he was working on.
Right. He basically was one of the original recyclers in this world. He found a material that was otherwise going to be garbage and found a way to make it useful and productive.
And so he came up with this idea for an above ground ice house, which itself would have been a big innovation. But once he had that idea, he sort of applied it to a ship as well. Yeah, so there he actually found a difficult time finding merchants or shippers that would be willing to let him sort of customize their ships to fit the ice. So what he ended up doing in 1805 is purchasing his own vessel, and he outfitted it himself that way, and basically built a floating above ground ice house. And so then he came up with the idea, as he mentioned, he had been to the Bahamas earlier in his life, so he knew it was quite hot down there, and they might have a desire to have some ice, and maybe be willing to pay for some ice as well. And so he sends his sailing ship down to the Bahamas loaded up with some of his ice, right?
Yeah, his first shipment was about 120 tons, and everyone in Boston ridiculed him constantly. There was a newspaper article that came out where the title was something to the effect of, no joke, crazy man decides to ship a cargo of ice to the Bahamas. Let's hope this doesn't prove to be a slippery situation. And so what he did is he loaded his boat full of ice, and he sealed the deck with both a combination of clay and waxes to sort of make an airtight barrier. That helped to further keep the warm air of the tropics out of his ship. And so he set sail in February of 1806, and his shipment arrived sometime in March of that year, and the rest, as they say, became history.
He actually had some ice left over when he got down there, right?
Yeah, he arrived with something close to about 65 or 70 tons, so he did lose some. So it's important to note that he wasn't able to prevent all melting, right? He prevented enough melting that there was still a cargo of ice left over that he could actually sell.
Well, that's pretty fascinating. So he starts then being able to ship ice around to different parts of the world, like to say to the Caribbean, and I guess probably to the southern United States. Now he has to get this ice from somewhere. I mean, there are lots of ponds and lakes in Massachusetts or around Boston, but still somebody had to send him the ice, and that's where we can pick up with another person that's a part of our story here, right?
Yeah, the second person that's really a major factor in this industry was Nathaniel Wyeth. Now, Wyeth's family owned a hotel that was on the shores of Fresh Pond out in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which isn't too far from the bay at all. So it provided a perfect pond or location to ship the ice from the pond to the docks. And it was sufficiently large that it made sense for them to actually harvest the ice from that pond. But what Nathaniel Wyeth really did is as Tudor started buying more and more ice from the local farmers, because keep in mind, most of the people in Boston were farmers at the time. And in the winter, there are no crops to harvest.
Right.
So we have a bunch of idle labor and a bunch of idle capital lying around doing essentially nothing, living off of what they had produced over the summer months. And so what Tudor would do is he would employ these people during the winter, so they were making some extra money, and he would have them cut ice, and he would buy the ice from them for somewhere around 30 to 40 cents per ton. But he noticed one person's ice blocks were particularly good. They were always evenly sized, they had straight edges, they packed really efficiently in the ship's hull, and they were just better in lots of ways. So he investigated and he found Nathaniel Wyeth. And Nathaniel, what he was doing was using horse-drawn plows to actually score the ice in a grid fashion. And then he'd use big wedges to try to break the ice apart. And this way the blocks were all the same size. He could get them out much faster than his competitors around the pond. And because they were all the same size and they were smooth on the edges, they actually stored a lot more efficiently. So they didn't slide around and knock into each other as the ship was sailing. They didn't break apart as much as other people's ice. And so what ended up happening is these two combined and formed the Tudor Ice Company.
And so then this was, I guess, then a very important innovation here, because it helped create the ice in ways that made it more shippable.
Right, exactly. So the big challenge with shipping ice, aside from preventing the melting, is also preventing the ice from moving around and breaking apart. So it turns out the way we can calculate how fast ice will melt is a direct relationship between the amount of surface area that there is. This is why when you put crushed ice cubes in your drink, they melt faster than the cubed ice. There's more surface area. The cold dissipates faster into the beverage that you're trying to chill. The same is true of ice in hulls. The more surface area, the faster it melts. And so what you want to do is minimize that surface area. And so Nathaniel Wyeth's blocks, having the smooth sides and being easily packed, helped to do that tremendously.
And he actually ended up, Wyeth got a patent for his ice plow, right?
Yeah, he got a patent for his ice plow, and later on it became the basis of a U.S. patent Supreme Court case, where prior to this, if you owned a patent to an idea, you essentially owned the idea and not just a particular instantiation of that idea. So if we can think about perhaps a shovel, if you had the patent to the shovel, you owned the idea to any tool that roughly resembled a shovel that was used to excavate the dirt. Now this is tremendously inefficient and would prevent all sorts of innovation.
Right.
And so what happened is another competitor had been using a similar plow to Wyeth's, and Wyeth took him to court trying to enforce his patent, and the Supreme Court said no. Wyeth, you only own the rights to that particular instantiation of the idea, not to the idea itself. And so we can imagine what the world would look like if the Supreme Court had ruled the other way.
Right.
Think about what the smartphone industry would look like if Steve Jobs owned the patent to all sorts of smart devices. It'd be absurd. So,
through the efforts of Wyeth and Tudor, they actually achieved quite a bit in the way of economies in terms of reducing the cost of producing this ice, right?
Yeah, so one thing we notice about technological progress is it tends to drive down the cost of production. And as the cost of production falls, so too does the price. So technological progress and availability of goods at low prices go hand in hand. And so what we saw prior to 1825, the price of ice was somewhere around 30 cents per ton. After 1825 and Wyeth's inventions, the price of ice had declined all the way to 10 cents per ton. So it was cut by a factor of a third. And so it was an amazing achievement. And it was, his ice plow scoring the ice. He invented an elevator system that would help get the blocks of ice up into the ice house. Eventually, he even invented a chain and pulley system, very similar to the one that hauls people to the top of a roller coaster, to use that to get the ice out of the water. So his inventions, or his innovations, really drove this decline in the price of ice and made it more available to more people all around the world.
And it was just sort of harnessing, as opposed to harvesting, harnessing people's natural sort of curiosity or our intuitiveness, our ability to look at a problem now that we see it as a problem and try to how to figure out how to do this better.
Right, exactly. And so the key here is that people were making money at doing this, and they had no other means of making money in the winter time for the most part, at least not in Boston. And the idea here is that if I can do something better than my competitor, I will increase my business success. And that's what really drove Wyeth and also Tudor as well.
Now, part of this tale involved an issue regarding property rights, because ice had been, nature formed the ice naturally on ponds, but until the ice industry sort of came along here and really took off under what Tudor was doing, there was no need to worry about, nobody worried about who owned the ice, right? And so there's a property rights problem here.
Exactly. And so what's going on here is we see this non-scarce resource. And yes, there was a finite amount, but it wasn't exactly scarce because the amount that was naturally available satisfied everyone's desires for it, and then some, actually. And so we didn't have any property rights to ice prior to the ice industry because there wasn't a need for it.
How does that, now, to economists, we now know that makes a lot of sense because of the work of this gentleman, Harold Demsetz, UCLA economist, who looked at the origin of many property rights. But it turns out that property rights themselves are sort of costly to define and enforce, aren't they?
Yeah, there's a lot of determinations that have to be made in what exactly the property rights are going to look like, who's going to own what, how we're going to settle these disputes. And so there has to be some sort of a decision process that goes into delineating who owns what, no matter what the resource is. In this case, we're talking about ice. But in all cases, there are massive costs in determining sort of who gets to use the resource and who doesn't. And under what circumstances am I allowed to exclude someone else from using my property?
And it's just if enough of the ice or whatever was happening, because the Demsetz look at the case of beavers or other things that are available naturally in nature, if there's enough of that to satisfy what our human needs or uses of it, it doesn't make sense to devise these property rights. But it is important once we get to the point of where we're using enough of it, or and it starts to become valuable, that we do need to define some property rights.
Right. So this harkens back to an essay written by Garrett Hardin in 1968 in Nature magazine, where he describes the tragedy of the commons. And so what's going on here is as the ice is becoming more and more valuable, more and more people from the local community are flocking to it to try to get some of the ice and sell it to Tudor and also his competitors around the pond as well. But as this is going on, they're racing each other. Remember, it's the first, when there's no property rights, the only way we can allocate this now valuable resource is on a first come, first served basis. And so what we saw were people racing to get to the ice first. And that creates all sorts of problems.
Now, let's go into that to some extent, because you would think none of the farmers around there were doing anything to actually create the ice. As Mother Nature was taking care of it with the cold temperatures that beset Massachusetts every winter. But even still in this case, there ends up being a part of the story is that there is some value in having the ice get thicker, and it depends on how long you could keep the ice on the pond, right? Right.
So a big issue that started to arise in the 1820s and 1830s was actually people coming to the ice too early. As I'm sure anyone who's walked on a frozen pond too early in the winter can tell you, if you put too much weight on the ice, you fall right through. And so we actually have records of horses and people and machinery, or rather equipment, falling through the ice because they were racing each other to get there before everyone else. So the property rights structure is important to allow the ice to freeze sufficiently thick to hold people up. But it became even more important in the 1830s when some people started shipping ice further away. So Frederic Tudor, for example, eventually started shipping ice all the way to Calcutta, India, which if you think about it, this is way prior to the Suez Canal, which means he had to sail around the tip of Africa, crossing the equator twice. And so what he needed, which was unique, was ice that was thicker. So remember, ice melts in direct proportion to the amount of surface area that it is. And so if there's thicker blocks of ice, it will have less surface area per volume. And so what Tudor needed were thick blocks of ice. But the only way to have thicker blocks of ice is to leave them on the pond for a longer time. But if everyone can come and grab ice whenever they want, and thicker ice is more valuable than thin ice, there wouldn't be any reason to suspect anyone leaving the ice on the pond to become thick enough.
And so there was a problem, particularly in Massachusetts, under state law that was going to prevent the development or emergence of property rights. Can you tell us briefly what was involved with that?
Yeah, so you're referencing a Colonial Ordinance from 1647. So it was originally enacted basically to try to prevent people from buying a foot of land all the way around a big pond, or as the ordinance calls them, great ponds. So imagine if you owned a land all the way around the pond. You could effectively exclude people from accessing the pond by virtue of restricting their access to your land. What this ordinance did is it said that it's illegal to actually restrict people from coming on to sufficiently large ponds because these ponds were an important source of revenue or even just food. People fished, they harvested things from the lake to try to feed their families. And so the original intent of the ordinance was to prevent people from preventing others coming onto the lake. Right? It was a perfectly legitimate use of that law. We wanted to make sure that everyone had equal access to the fish in the pond. But it ended up getting in the way of this property rights structure because it's now illegal to restrict access to the pond, but we need to find a way to restrict people's access to the pond, particularly when it has ice on it that was becoming more valuable.
And so the Massachusetts legislature remedied this by passing a law that then allowed some property rights to develop. And I mean, one of the things that you're telling your story here is that actually Tudor made the ice thicker. Once we had property rights established, Tudor and the people in the ice industry actually figured out a way to make the ice thicker than nature would have made it naturally, right?
Right. So at Boston, at the time, the ice would naturally freeze to maybe 4 inches thick, 5 in a particularly cold winter. But Tudor wanted thicker ice. So what you can see in this picture here are people with giant sheets of ice. Right? These are sheets of ice that have been cut, and what they're about to do is actually slide that sheet underneath the other ice on the left side of the picture there. And in doing so, they're going to make the ice thicker. And so what we saw is Tudor's ice, when he had the ability to actually invest in the thickness of it, would be sometimes as thick as 22 inches, which is a tremendous improvement over the 4 or 5 inches that nature could provide. So the property rights structure actually allowed Tudor to invest in making his ice higher quality.
And just yet again, another innovation that helped drive progress in this case. Now, one of the things that happens when we establish property rights is that we can have more value creation, and the value of land around the Fresh Pond, this one notable pond in Massachusetts, illustrates this, right?
Yeah, so what we ended up doing, or what the people around the pond ended up settling on, was delineating the pond according to the amount of surface area or shoreline that a person owned. So the more shoreline you had, the more access or the more ice on the pond that you had the right to. And so what we end up seeing is that the use rights to that ice become very valuable. Right, extremely valuable, because the ice is extremely valuable. And so what we saw prior to the 1840s is an acre of land abutting Fresh Pond would sell for about $130. But after the 1840s, Frederic Tudor himself was turning down offers for $2,000 per acre, which is a tremendous improvement in the price. But this extended not just to Tudor, but to everyone around the pond as well. So we saw people who owned, maybe a small sliver of shoreline on this pond. They could now sell the use rights to their ice to other people. So let's say I owned, 100 feet of shoreline on Fresh Pond. that's not going to be enough ice to make it worth my while to invest in the equipment to harvest it or even to store it. But it might be worth a lot to, say, Frederic Tudor or Nathaniel Wyeth, who could then buy the rights to use that ice from me.
So that's cool. And I guess you have a map here, or the picture of a map that shows how the people there worked out their property rights arrangements. And more importantly, it illustrates a point that the lady on the right here, this is Eleanor Ostrom, who's famous for being the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, that a point that she made in the work that she did on property rights, right?
Right. So what we have here is a picture of the map that the people around the pond were able to create themselves in partnership with a man named Simon Greenleaf, who was a Harvard law professor at the time. But what they did is they settled on using shoreline as a rough proxy for the percentage of the area of the pond that you got to use. And so what we have is sort of a local community coming together and solving the problem on their own. And the key here is that the Massachusetts legislature allowed them to do so by sort of reinterpreting the Colonial Ordinance to allow ice to be treated legally as land. And so because you can own land, that allows people to exclude the access to the pond during the winter and only during the winter. So during the summer, people were free to access the pond for whatever purposes they wanted. But during the winter time, the pond became the property of the people around it. And the people around it had to sort of delineate who owned which ice, because saying that I own half the ice on the pond doesn't really mean anything unless I own a specific half of the pond. And so what we have is a bunch of lines crisscrossing the pond, because unfortunately the pond was not a perfect circle, so we couldn't just put a stick in the middle of it and do it that way. But what we have are the lines that the people themselves were able to create. And what this speaks volumes to is the ability of private individuals to solve their own disputes without having to turn to perhaps a coercive hand of government to solve them for them. We were able to come together and solve these issues on our own.
Now, this example is fascinating, but it also shows many of the same principles that we see operating in the economy overall. And one of them, I think we want to mention here, it deals with the role of commerce in helping to improve quality of life. This is a rather long quote, but it's from an article about describing experiences of a man from Boston traveling in India in the 1850s and seeing the effect that ice had on India. And so if you could just sort of talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, so Frederic Tudor established a ice house in Calcutta in about 1837. And it was one of the largest ice houses that he'd ever actually built. And it was constantly stocked with ice. And like we were saying earlier, the price of ice was about 10 cents a ton. So it was available cheaply and readily to basically everyone. And because of all of his innovations with the above-ground ice house, he was actually able to ship ice from Boston to India year-round. So there was never a time where a cargo of ice was not leaving Boston, which is a remarkable achievement in and of itself. But because the ice was so available, they were able to use it for lots of different things. Let's say you wanted to have some ice cream. You could have ice cream. In fact, even the upper, lower class families could afford to have regular ice cream. But more importantly, we were able to use it for medicinal purposes. So imagine if you have a fever, right? Today we say, oh, take some ibuprofen. They didn't have ibuprofen back then. They had to use something to cool a person down. But if you're in India, there's nothing there that can cool you down. And so what the doctors there would do is they would break off little chips of the ice blocks and they would actually feed them to their patients. This saved thousands, if not millions, of lives.
Well, this is just completely fascinating. I think it's a great story in lots of things. And to think of, like, as this quote says, I mean, all of the people that had come to India from the West beforehand, and they came there for military conquest, but they didn't necessarily make the place better. And there's a guy from Boston who was just trying to make a profit from selling ice, improved these lives. I think it's really quite amazing. Well, we've come to the end of our time. Thanks very much for coming on. I've enjoyed this conversation, and thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.